The smell of whiskey and desperation hung thick in the air when Eleanor Harper's mother dragged her through the swinging doors of the Silver Spur Saloon in Hillsborough, New Mexico, and announced to the room that her daughter was for sale. Eleanor felt her stomach drop to her dusty boots, the July heat of 1883 suddenly feeling like ice in her veins. She was 19 years old, and in that moment, she understood that her brother's gambling debts had finally cost her everything. $50, her mother said, her voice cracking but determined. That's what I need. $50 and she's yours. She can cook, she can clean, she can do whatever you need. Eleanor wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to disappear into the floorboards of that saloon, but her mother's fingers were like iron around her wrist. The men in the room turned to stare, some with pity, most with interest that made her skin crawl. Her brother Thomas had lost big at a poker game in Santa Fe 2 weeks ago, and the men he owed weren't the patient type. They'd given her mother a deadline, and that deadline was tomorrow. I'll take her. The voice came from the back corner, deep and steady. Eleanor's eyes found the speaker, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that touched his collar. He wore a simple brown vest over a white shirt, both covered in trail dust, and a black hat sat on the table beside him. His eyes were the color of strong coffee, and they held something she couldn't quite name as he looked at her. Not hunger like the other men. Something different. He stood, and Eleanor saw he was easily over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. He walked toward them with a confident stride, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he reached them, he pulled out a leather pouch and counted out $50 onto the nearest table. "There's your money," he said to her mother, his voice flat. Eleanor's mother snatched it up quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. She didn't even look at her daughter as she turned to leave. "She's yours now. Do what you want with her." "Mama, please," Eleanor whispered, but her mother was already gone, the saloon doors swinging in her wake. The cowboy looked down at Eleanor, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, determined not to cry in front of all these strangers. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was probably in his mid-20s, and there was something about the set of his mouth that suggested he'd seen his share of hard times. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Eleanor," she managed. "Eleanor Harper," he nodded once. "Quinn Reeves, you got things you need to collect from home." She shook her head. Everything she owned was in the small bag her mother had brought with them. The cowboy picked it up, then gestured toward the door. "Come on, then." Eleanor followed him outside into the blazing afternoon sun, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. 2 horses were tied at the hitching post, a large bay gelding and a smaller paint mare. Quinn secured her bag to his saddle, then turned to her. "You can ride." "Yes, sir. Don't call me sir. Quinn's fine." He untied the paint mare and handed her the reins. "This is Daisy. She's gentle." Eleanor took the reins with shaking hands and mounted the horse, years of farm work making the motion automatic despite her fear. Quinn swung up onto his bay with easy grace and turned the horse north, out of town. Eleanor followed because she had no other choice, watching the dusty streets of Hillsborough fall away behind them. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through scrubby desert landscape, dotted with juniper and piñon trees. The Mimbres Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the bright sky. Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. Where was he taking her? What did he intend to do with her? She'd heard stories about men who bought women, and none of them ended well. Finally, they crested a small rise, and Eleanor saw a ranch spread out in the valley below. It wasn't large, but it looked well maintained. A modest house sat near a barn and a few outbuildings, with a corral holding several horses. A creek ran along the property's eastern edge, lined with cottonwood trees that provided blessed shade. Quinn led them down to the house and dismounted, then waited for her to do the same. Eleanor's legs felt unsteady as she touched the ground. He grabbed her bag and walked to the porch, and she followed slowly. Inside, the house was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, 2 doors that presumably led to bedrooms. The furniture was handmade and sturdy, the kind that lasted generations. Quinn set her bag down by one of the bedroom doors. "That room's yours," he said, nodding toward it. "Door has a lock on the inside if you want to use it." Eleanor stared at him, confusion cutting through her fear. "I don't understand." Quinn removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. He looked tired, she realized. Bone tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. "Your mother sold you to pay a debt," he said flatly. "That's about the lowest thing I can think of a person doing. I bought you so one of those other men in that saloon wouldn't." "But you don't owe me anything, Eleanor. You don't have to pay for what your brother did, and you sure as hell don't have to pay for your mother's choices." Eleanor felt tears burn her eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. "Then, why did you spend $50 on me?" "Because it was the right thing to do." He said it simply, as if it were obvious. "You're free to leave whenever you want. There's a stage that runs through Hillsborough twice a week if you want to go somewhere else. Or you can stay here. I could use help around the place, and I'd pay you fair wages." "Your choice." She couldn't help it then. The tears spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs she'd been holding back for 2 weeks, ever since Thomas had stumbled home drunk and bleeding and told their mother what he'd done. Ever since her mother had looked at her with cold calculation and said she knew how to fix it. Eleanor felt a gentle touch on her shoulder, and when she looked up through her tears, Quinn was offering her a clean handkerchief. She took it gratefully, pressing it to her face. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry, I just—" "Don't apologize," Quinn said quietly. "You've got every right to cry. Take your time." He moved to the kitchen and busied himself with making coffee, giving her space while staying close enough that she didn't feel abandoned. Eleanor sank into one of the chairs by the table, trying to get control of herself. The room smelled like wood smoke and leather and something else, something that reminded her of rain even though it hadn't rained in weeks. By the time Quinn brought over 2 cups of coffee, she'd managed to stop crying, though her face felt hot and swollen. She accepted the cup with a mumbled thanks and wrapped her hands around it, grateful for something to hold on to. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a moment. "Go ahead." "Why do you live out here alone?" Quinn settled into the chair across from her, cradling his own cup. "Lost my family 6 years ago, cholera outbreak. My wife, my little girl. After that, I couldn't stay in the place where we'd been happy, needed to go somewhere new. Ended up here about 4 years back." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago." But the pain in his eyes said otherwise. "What about you? You got other family besides your mother and brother?" "My father died when I was 12, kicked by a horse." Eleanor stared into her coffee. "Thomas is 5 years older than me. He always had a problem with cards and dice, but it got worse after Papa died. Mama keeps bailing him out, keeps making excuses. This time, he lost so much money to some men from Santa Fe that she couldn't borrow enough to cover it. So she decided to sell me instead. And your brother, he just let her." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Thomas left town 3 days ago, hasn't been back since. I think he knew what she was planning." Quinn's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. Eleanor realized with surprise that she felt safer than she had in weeks, despite being alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. There was something steady about Quinn Reeves, something that made her believe he meant what he said. "If I stay," she said slowly, "what would you want me to do?" "Whatever you're willing to do. Cooking, if you don't mind. I'm tired of my own meals. Maybe help with the garden when it needs it. Mending, washing, general housekeeping. I work the horses mostly, training them for sale. It keeps me busy from dawn to dusk most days. And you'd pay me, room, board, and $10 a month. That's fair, isn't it?" It was more than fair. It was generous. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I'll stay. At least for a while, if that's all right. Stay as long as you like." Quinn stood and carried his empty cup to the basin. "I'll show you around the place and then you can settle in. We'll figure out the details as we go." The next few days passed in a strange sort of peace. Eleanor explored the ranch, learning its rhythms and routines. The house was easy to care for since Quinn was neat by nature, but she threw herself into cooking proper meals and organizing the kitchen the way she liked it. It gave her something to focus on besides the hollow ache in her chest every time she thought about her mother walking away. Quinn was gone most of each day, working with the horses in the corral or riding out to check on the small herd of cattle he kept on the range inland. When he was around, he was quiet but not unfriendly, always polite, always respectful. He'd clearly meant what he said about her owing him nothing. He never came into her room, never made any demands, never even looked at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. It made her curious about him. One evening about a week after her arrival, she was preparing dinner when Quinn came in from the barn, dustier than usual. He had a cut on his forearm that was bleeding through his shirt. "What happened?" Eleanor asked, immediately concerned. "One of the younger horses got spooked. Scraped me against the fence rail." He looked at the wound with mild annoyance. "It's nothing. Sit down," Eleanor ordered, already moving to the cupboard where she'd seen medical supplies. "Let me clean it." Quinn looked like he might argue, but he sat at the table and rolled up his sleeve. The cut was about 3 inches long, not deep but jagged. Eleanor heated water and gathered clean cloths, then settled into the chair next to him. "This might sting," she warned, and began cleaning the wound gently. Quinn didn't flinch, but she felt him tense slightly. His arm was corded with muscle, tanned dark from the sun except for a band of paler skin where his watch usually sat. Eleanor found herself noticing details: a small scar near his elbow, the calluses on his palm, the way his fingers rested loosely on his knee. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "I used to help my father with the animals when they got hurt, and Thomas was always getting into scrapes." She finished cleaning the cut and began wrapping it with clean bandaging. "There, keep it covered for a few days." "Thank you." Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. In the warm lamplight, Quinn's face had lost some of its hardness. He looked younger, more vulnerable. She realized she was still holding his arm and released it quickly, standing up to put away the supplies. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said, her voice a little too bright. "I'll wash up." That night, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Eleanor thought about the way Quinn had looked at her. Like she mattered. Like she was more than just a burden or a commodity. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, maybe ever. Her mother had always looked at her with vague disappointment, as if Eleanor's existence was somehow a personal failing. Thomas had never looked at her at all, too wrapped up in his own problems. But Quinn saw her. Really saw her. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. As the weeks passed, Eleanor found herself looking forward to Quinn's presence more than she wanted to admit. She learned his preferences and habits, how he took his coffee black and strong, that he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, that he read books in the evening by lamplight, everything from dime novels to Shakespeare. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he was patient with animals in a way that suggested deep kindness, that when he smiled, really smiled, it transformed his whole face, and Quinn seemed to be learning her just as thoroughly. He brought her wildflowers one day without explanation, just set them on the kitchen table and said he thought she might like them. He fixed the loose board on her bedroom floor without being asked. He started talking more, telling her stories about the horses, about the land, about the people in town. Small things, but they added up to something that felt like friendship, something that felt like it could become more. One Saturday in late August, Quinn asked if she'd like to go to town with him. He needed supplies, and he thought she might want to pick out some things for herself. Eleanor hesitated, afraid of running into her mother or Thomas, but Quinn must have seen the worry on her face. "I'll be with you the whole time," he said. "Nobody's going to bother you." So she went, riding Daisy beside Quinn's bay along the familiar trail to Hillsborough. The town was busy with weekend activity, people moving between the general store and the bank and the various saloons. Eleanor kept her head down as they tied the horses outside the mercantile, but Quinn's presence beside her felt like a shield. Inside, the store was crowded and smelled like coffee beans and new fabric. Quinn conducted his business efficiently, ordering feed and supplies to be delivered to the ranch. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Pick out anything you need, clothes, personal items, whatever you want." "I have everything I need," she said, uncomfortable with the idea of him spending more money on her. "Eleanor." He said her name gently. "You've been wearing the same 3 dresses since you arrived. Let me do this." She wanted to argue, but the kindness in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she nodded and moved to the section of the store that held women's goods. There were bolts of fabric, ready-made dresses, ribbons and laces and buttons. Eleanor's fingers traced over a length of blue calico, and she found herself imagining making a new dress, something that was truly hers. "That color suits you," Quinn said from behind her. Eleanor turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Her cheeks heated, but she smiled. "You think so? I know so. Get it. Get whatever you need to make yourself a dress. Get 2 if you want." In the end, she selected the blue calico and a soft green cotton, along with thread, buttons, and a new pair of work gloves. Quinn added a bag of peppermint sticks without comment, and Eleanor's heart squeezed at the gesture. He paid for everything, chatting easily with the shopkeeper, and they were about to leave when a voice stopped them cold. "Well, if it isn't my darling daughter." Eleanor froze. Her mother stood in the doorway, blocking their exit. She looked older than Eleanor remembered, more worn down, but her eyes were sharp and calculating as they swept over Eleanor's new packages. "Mama," Eleanor said quietly, "I see you've done well for yourself." Her mother's gaze shifted to Quinn, and something like recognition flickered across her face. "Mr. Reeves, you taking good care of my daughter." "She's not your daughter anymore," Quinn said flatly. "You sold that right." Her mother's expression hardened. "I did what I had to do. Thomas is my son. Family takes care of family." "Family doesn't sell each other," Eleanor heard herself say. The words came out stronger than she expected. "You chose Thomas over me. You made that choice, and now I've made mine. I don't want to see you again." Her mother's face flushed red. "You ungrateful little thing, after everything I've done for you." "That's enough." Quinn's voice was quiet, but it carried an edge that made Eleanor's mother take a step back. Eleanor said what she needed to say. "Now move aside." For a moment, Eleanor thought her mother might argue, but something in Quinn's stance must have convinced her otherwise. She stepped aside, and Quinn guided Eleanor out of the store with a gentle hand on her back. Outside, Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her packages. Quinn took them from her and secured them to his saddle, then turned to face her. "You all right? I don't know." Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, even though the day was hot. "I thought I'd be angrier if I saw her again, but I just feel empty." "That'll pass," Quinn said gently. "You stood up for yourself. That took courage. I couldn't have done it without you here." His hand found hers, warm and steady. "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad I was here anyway." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, their horses walking side by side. Eleanor kept thinking about the feel of Quinn's hand in hers, the way he'd stood beside her without hesitation. When they arrived home and began unloading the supplies, she found herself watching him, really looking at him. He'd become so important to her, she realized. Somewhere in the past weeks, he'd become the center of her world, the thing she oriented around. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it felt right. Natural. That evening they ate dinner on the porch, enjoying the slight cooling that came with sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and crickets sang in the grass. Quinn had been quieter than usual since they returned, and Eleanor wondered what he was thinking. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Always. Why haven't you remarried? After your wife passed, I mean." "It's been 6 years." Quinn was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. "I loved my wife," he said finally. "Loved her with everything I had. When she died, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd used up my chance at that kind of happiness. I never expected to feel anything like that again." Something in his tone made Eleanor's heart beat faster. "And now," he turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Now I'm starting to think I was wrong." The air between them felt charged, heavy with possibility. Eleanor set down her plate with trembling hands. "Quinn, I know it hasn't been long," he said quickly. "I know you probably need more time, but Eleanor, you've brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead. You make this house feel like a home again. You make me laugh. You make me want to be better. I care about you. I care about you more than I probably should, given the circumstances." Eleanor's eyes burned with tears, but this time they were happy tears. "I care about you too, so much. You saved me, Quinn. Not just from that saloon, but from giving up on everything good. You showed me what kindness looks like. You showed me that I'm worth something." "You're worth everything," he said fiercely. He stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. "You're smart and strong and beautiful, and any man would be lucky to have you. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. But if you'd be willing, if you'd give me the chance, I'd like to court you properly. I'd like to see if this thing between us could grow into something more." Eleanor reached out and cupped his face in her hand, feeling the roughness of his stubble against her palm. "I don't need courting, Quinn. I already know how I feel. I love you. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first day in the saloon, when you looked at me like I was a person instead of property." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. "Eleanor Harper, you're going to make me the happiest man in New Mexico." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Eleanor melted into it, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling like she'd finally come home after a lifetime of wandering. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "I know it's fast, but life's too short to waste time. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Eleanor breathed. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in Hillsboro's small church, with the preacher and his wife serving as witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress she'd made from the blue calico, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Quinn wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous in equal measure. When he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for the rest of his life, Eleanor felt something broken inside her begin to heal. The ranch became truly theirs after that, not just a place they both lived, but a home they built together. Eleanor planted a larger garden, growing vegetables and herbs and flowers. Quinn built her a chicken coop, and soon they had fresh eggs every morning. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, learning the geography of love and desire, building intimacy one touch at a time. Eleanor discovered that Quinn was a generous lover, patient and attentive, more concerned with her pleasure than his own. He learned what made her gasp, what made her sigh, what made her cry out his name. She learned that beneath his quiet exterior, he burned hot, that he loved her with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away. They talked for hours in the darkness, sharing dreams and fears and memories. Quinn told her about his first wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Emma, about the joy they'd brought him and the devastation of losing them. Eleanor told him about her childhood, about the slow dissolution of her family after her father's death, about the moment she realized her mother saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. "You're not a burden," Quinn said fiercely, pulling her close. "You're a gift. The best thing that ever happened to me. We're both gifts," Eleanor whispered against his chest. "We saved each other." As autumn painted the mountains in gold and red, Eleanor began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited to be sure, watching her body for signs, and when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the second time, she knew. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She wanted this baby desperately, wanted to give Quinn the family he'd lost, but she was also afraid. Afraid something might go wrong. Afraid she might not be a good mother. Afraid of carrying the same coldness her own mother had shown her. She told Quinn on an October evening when frost was just starting to touch the grass. They were in the kitchen, and he was helping her prepare dinner, stealing kisses between chopping vegetables. Eleanor set down her knife and turned to face him. "Quinn, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in her tone made him immediately attentive. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" "No." "I'm pregnant." His eyes went wide, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then a grin spread across his face so big and bright it made her laugh. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We're having a baby. You're happy?" Eleanor asked, even though the answer was obvious. "Happy?" He set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. "Eleanor, I'm beyond happy. I'm blessed. I never thought I'd get this chance again, and now I have you and we're going to have a child together. It's more than I ever dreamed possible." His joy eased her fears, and when he dropped to his knees and pressed a kiss to her still flat stomach, Eleanor knew everything would be all right. They would figure this out together, just like they'd figured out everything else. The winter passed slowly, with Quinn becoming increasingly protective as Eleanor's belly grew. He insisted she rest more. He took over the heavier chores. He fretted over every twinge and discomfort. Eleanor found it both endearing and exasperating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she told him one January afternoon when he'd insisted she sit down after folding laundry for 10 minutes. "I know that, but I want to take care of you." His hand settled on the swell of her stomach and his expression softened. "Both of you." How could she argue with that? Their son was born on a mild April morning in 1884, after a long night of labor. The doctor from Hillsborough arrived just in time, and Quinn stayed by Eleanor's side through the whole ordeal, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, Eleanor collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and elated. "A boy," the doctor announced, cutting the cord and wrapping the infant in a clean blanket. "A healthy boy." He placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face, overwhelmed by love so fierce it was almost painful. The baby had Quinn's dark hair and her nose, and when he opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns, unfocused and wondering. "He's beautiful," Quinn whispered, settling onto the bed beside them. There were tears on his face, and he didn't bother to hide them. "You're both so beautiful." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. Quinn was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing gently over the baby's tiny hand. "I'd like to name him Daniel, after my father, but only if you agree." "Daniel Reeves," Eleanor said, testing the name. It felt right. "I love it." Life with a baby was harder than Eleanor had anticipated, but more rewarding than she'd ever imagined. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and alert, with a powerful set of lungs he wasn't afraid to use. Eleanor spent her days feeding him, changing him, rocking him to sleep, and falling more in love with him every moment. Quinn was a devoted father, patient and gentle, always willing to walk the floor with Daniel at 2 in the morning when he was fussy. Watching Quinn with their son, Eleanor sometimes felt her heart might burst from happiness. This was everything she'd never let herself dream of: a husband who loved her, a child who needed her, a home that was truly hers. The scars from her past were still there, but they were fading, becoming just another part of her story rather than the whole of it. One afternoon, when Daniel was about 6 months old, Eleanor was in town purchasing supplies when she saw Thomas. Her brother was stumbling out of a saloon, clearly drunk despite the early hour. He looked terrible, his face puffy and unshaven, his clothes dirty. For a moment their eyes met, and Eleanor saw recognition and shame flicker across his features. He started toward her, and Eleanor felt her body tense, preparing to run. But before Thomas could reach her, Quinn stepped out of the general store, moving to Eleanor's side with casual purpose. Thomas stopped in his tracks. "Eleanor," he said, his voice slurred. "Ellie, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about everything." "You should be," Eleanor said coldly. "You ruined your life with gambling, and then you let Mama ruin mine to fix your mistakes." "I know. I tried to stop her, I swear, but she wouldn't listen." Thomas swayed on his feet. "I just kept hoping I could win the money back, fix it myself, but I couldn't. You could have sold your horse. You could have worked to pay it off. You could have done 100 things that didn't involve selling your sister." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Quinn's hand found hers, squeezing gently. Thomas looked at Quinn, then back at Eleanor. "Are you happy, at least? Did everything turn out okay?" "No thanks to you," Quinn said quietly. "Eleanor made her own happiness, despite what you and your mother did. Now I think it's time you left." Thomas nodded miserably and shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "You all right?" Quinn asked. "Yes," and she meant it. Seeing Thomas again hadn't hurt the way she'd expected. He was just a sad, broken man who'd made terrible choices. She'd moved beyond him, beyond all of that. "I'm more than all right. I have everything I need." They rode home together, talking about Daniel and the ranch and plans for the future. Eleanor felt lighter somehow, as if confronting Thomas had closed a door she'd been holding open without realizing it. As the years passed, their family grew. Eleanor gave birth to a daughter 2 years after Daniel, a beautiful girl they named Lily, who had Eleanor's blonde hair and Quinn's dark eyes. Then another son, James, 2 years after that. The house rang with children's laughter, with the chaos and joy of family life. Quinn expanded the ranch, breeding horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality. Eleanor's garden flourished, and she started selling her preserves and baked goods in town, earning her own income that she saved carefully. They had hard times too. A drought one summer that killed half their cattle. A winter so harsh they nearly lost the barn to snow load. Daniel breaking his arm falling from a tree, and the terrifying ride to the doctor. Lily getting scarlet fever, and the 3 days she burned with temperature while Eleanor and Quinn took turns sitting by her bedside, praying. But they weathered every storm together, their love deepening with each challenge they faced. Quinn proved again and again that he meant his wedding vows, that he would be there in sickness and health, in good times and bad. And Eleanor did the same, standing beside him when his nightmares brought back memories of Sarah and Emma, helping him understand that loving them and loving her weren't mutually exclusive, that the heart had room for all kinds of love. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Eleanor to the spot where they'd first arrived at the ranch together. That day she'd been so frightened and uncertain. They stood looking out over the land they'd built together, the house where they'd raised their children, the life they'd created from nothing. "You ever regret it?" Quinn asked quietly. "Staying with me? You could have gone anywhere, done anything." Eleanor turned to him, cupping his face in her hands the way she had that first night he'd told her he loved her. He was 41 now, silver threading through his dark hair, lines deepening around his eyes. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "I've never regretted a single moment," she said fiercely. "You gave me everything, Quinn. A home, a family, love, yourself. How could I ever regret that? You gave me everything too." He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "You brought me back to life, Eleanor. You showed me that second chances are real, that happiness doesn't run out. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." "Promise?" she asked, smiling against his shirt. "Promise?" They stood there as the sun set over their land, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. From the house, they could hear their children playing, Daniel's voice calling to his siblings. It was the sound of home, of happiness, of a future built on love and trust and second chances. Eleanor thought about that terrified girl in the saloon 10 years ago, being sold by her mother to pay for her brother's sins. She thought about Quinn stepping forward, saying those words that changed everything. "I'll take her." She thought about all the moments between then and now, all the ways they'd chosen each other again and again. Her mother had tried to sell her, to reduce her worth to $50 in a leather pouch, but Quinn had said, "You pay for nothing," and he'd meant it. He'd given her value not through purchase but through love. He'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, and in return, she'd given him a reason to live again, a reason to open his heart despite the pain of loss. They'd saved each other in the end. Two broken people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. Years continued to unfold like pages in a book. Daniel grew into a tall, serious young man who loved working with the horses just like his father. He had Quinn's steady nature and Eleanor's kindness, and when he turned 21, he started courting the daughter of a rancher from the next county over. Lily became a teacher, passionate about education and helping children learn. James, the youngest, had a wild streak that kept Eleanor and Quinn on their toes, but his laughter filled the house and his heart was pure gold. Eleanor's hair began to show threads of silver, and Quinn's face became more weathered, but neither cared. They'd earned every line, every gray hair, through lives well lived and love well given. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, still talked for hours, still reached for each other in the darkness of their bedroom. When Eleanor turned 45, Quinn surprised her with a trip to Santa Fe. They left the ranch in Daniel's capable hands and spent a week in the territorial capital, staying in a nice hotel, eating in restaurants, seeing the sights like tourists. It was silly and indulgent and wonderful. On their last night there, they walked through the plaza as the sun set, watching people go about their evening routines. Eleanor saw a woman with 2 young children, hurrying them along, and felt a pang of nostalgia for when her own children had been small. "Do you miss it?" she asked Quinn. "When they were little, sometimes," he admitted. "But I like this too, watching them become who they're meant to be, knowing we did our job raising them." He squeezed her hand. "And I like having you to myself more. Don't get me wrong, I love our kids, but there's something nice about it being just us again." Eleanor laughed. "You're terrible. You love me anyway, I do, more than anything." They returned home to find the ranch running smoothly, and Daniel beaming with pride at having managed everything himself. Lily had come home for their return, and James had made a welcome home banner that was endearingly crooked. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and Eleanor felt grateful all the way to her bones. A few months later, Daniel announced his engagement. The wedding was planned for the following spring, a big celebration that would bring together both families. Eleanor threw herself into preparations, sewing and cooking and planning, enjoying every moment. Quinn built furniture for the young couple, beautiful pieces crafted with care and love. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for a celebration. Eleanor watched her son marry his sweetheart and thought about her own wedding day, about how far they'd all come. Quinn stood beside her, handsome in his suit, and when he caught her eye, he winked. After more than 20 years together, he could still make her heart flutter. The celebration went late into the night, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Eleanor danced with Quinn under the stars, moving slowly to a fiddle's sweet melody, surrounded by friends and family and love. This was what she'd never known she could have. A full life, a family who chose her, happiness that wasn't borrowed or contingent. "Thank you," she whispered to Quinn as they swayed together. "For what? For seeing me. For saving me. For loving me." Quinn pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Eleanor Reeves, you saved yourself. You just let me come along for the ride." "We saved each other," she insisted. "Yeah," he agreed softly. "We did." As more years passed, they became grandparents. Daniel and his wife had 3 children, little ones who ran through the ranch house with abandon, who loved when Grandma Eleanor told them stories, and Grandpa Quinn took them to see the horses. Lily eventually married a lawyer from Hillsborough, and they had 2 daughters. James moved to Albuquerque to work for the railroad, but came home often, eventually bringing a wife back with him. Eleanor and Quinn grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never dimming. They still worked the ranch, though they'd hired help and Daniel had officially taken over most of the operations. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, still held hands, still talked about everything and nothing. When Eleanor turned 60, she looked back on her life with wonder. That frightened 19-year-old girl seemed like a different person, someone from a story rather than her own past. She'd become strong because she'd had to be, but also because Quinn had shown her she could be. He'd given her the space to find her own strength, her own worth. And Quinn, who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his first family, had learned that the heart was infinite, that loving again didn't diminish what came before but honored it. Sarah and Emma would always be part of him, but Eleanor and their children had their own place, equally important, equally cherished. One spring evening when they were both in their 70s, they sat on the porch watching the sunset as they'd done thousands of times before. The ranch was quiet, most of the grandchildren grown now, starting their own lives. Daniel ran the place with his sons, and it thrived under their care. Eleanor and Quinn had stepped back, content to watch the next generation take over. "You remember the first time we sat here together?" Eleanor asked, her hand in Quinn's. "Every detail," Quinn said. "You were so scared, so hurt. I wanted to fix it all for you right then. You did fix it, not all at once, but over time. You showed me what love was supposed to look like." Quinn raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. The gesture was one he'd made 1,000,000 times over the decades, but it still made Eleanor's heart warm. "We fixed it together, sweetheart. Everything we have, we built side by side. I love you, Quinn Reeves." "I love you too, Eleanor Reeves. Always have, always will." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The crickets sang, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The air smelled like sage and rain coming, that sweet desert smell that had become home. Eleanor thought about the moment her mother had dragged her into that saloon, about the desperation and fear that had consumed her. She thought about Quinn standing up, walking toward her, paying $50 not to own her but to free her. She thought about his words, "You pay for nothing." Those words had changed everything. They'd given her permission to see herself as valuable, as worthy of love and respect. They'd opened the door to a life she'd never imagined possible. And she'd walked through that door straight into Quinn's arms, into a love story that had lasted a lifetime and would continue until their last breaths. They'd been through so much together. Joy and sorrow, triumph and loss, the everyday miracles of a life well shared. They'd built a family, a legacy, a love that their children and grandchildren could see and hopefully emulate. Eleanor had been sold once, reduced to a transaction meant to pay for someone else's mistakes. But Quinn had transformed that moment of ultimate debasement into the beginning of her salvation. He'd given her freedom when he could have taken it. He'd offered love when he could have demanded service. He'd seen her as a person when everyone else saw her as property. And she'd loved him for it, loved him with everything she had for all these years. She'd given him a reason to hope again, to open his heart again, to build a new family without forgetting the old one. They'd healed each other's wounds and created something beautiful from their shared pain. As the last light faded from the sky and the desert night settled around them, Eleanor squeezed Quinn's hand. He squeezed back, and they sat together in perfect peace. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds and held on tight, through everything life threw at them. Their love story had started in the darkest of circumstances, but it had become something luminous, something that lit the way for everyone around them. It was proof that second chances were real, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes. Eleanor had been sold, but she'd found freedom. She'd been abandoned, but she'd found home. She'd been treated as worthless, but she'd discovered her own infinite value. And all of it had begun with a cowboy who'd stood up and said, "I'll take her," then proved that true love meant asking nothing and giving everything. They lived out their remaining years on the ranch they'd built together, surrounded by family and love, their story passed down through generations. And when they finally left this world, it was within days of each other, neither able to exist long without the other half of their heart. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their land, their matching headstones bearing their names and the dates that encompassed a lifetime of love. But their love didn't end there. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that still bore their mark, in the stories told around dinner tables about how Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa Quinn had found each other in the most unlikely way and built something extraordinary from it. Their love became legend, proof that darkness can lead to light, that broken things can be mended, that love is always worth the risk. Eleanor Harper had been sold to pay for her brother's mistakes, and Quinn Reeves had said, "You pay for nothing." In doing so, he'd given her everything: freedom, dignity, love, family, home, and she'd given him the same in return. Their love story was one for the ages, a testament to the power of seeing someone's worth when the whole world tries to diminish it, of choosing love over convenience, of building something beautiful from broken pieces. It was the story of two wounded souls who found each other in the Wild West and created their own version of paradise, their own happily ever after. And it was real, and it was lasting, and it was proof that sometimes the best love stories begin with the words, "I'll take her," and the promise that follows, "You pay for nothing."